at heart, it's about good fun, good times, good tunes, and that's a universal, right? Doesn't matter what culture you're from. People like to come to a nice space. They like to have a nice drink, whether it's alcoholic or not, and listen to some good music. If they want to talk a bit about other things, if they come here and it makes them go and do a bit of research and learning afterwards, and that's great.
Everybody in Australia is living, working, being on unceded Aboriginal land, but few people engage with it as deeply and, I guess, honestly, as Brendan Keown. He has recently opened Yarra Falls, a bar in Melbourne that attempts to engage with Australia's pre-colonial history. Brendan, welcome to Dirty Linen.
Hi, Dani. Great to be here.
Awesome to have you here. You've got a long history in hospitality, and some of it was not in Australia. I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of backstory.
Sure. The Brendan Keown story. I got my first job as a bartender at the age of 14. Obviously, back in Ireland, they're much more relaxed about that sort of thing.
Sounds like it.
Absolutely. That
must have been a very interesting start.
You know what? It was actually a fantastic start for me. So I lived in the country in Ireland, so not that far from anywhere. Ireland's a pretty small place, but there was a really good restaurant about 100 yards up the road. So my sister worked there, my brother worked there, and then I worked there. And they taught me a lot about, looking back, what I would call hospitality now. Although, at the time that term wasn't really in kind of use. It was just, you worked at a restaurant and a bar. But so many good things about service. It was very well regarded for its food. It was, there wasn't a lot of like great dining spots in that part of the country in the early mid-90s, and yeah, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I loved everything about the job. I had to polish and wash every glass by hand. There was no such thing as a glass washer. But I took so much pride in it. I loved cleaning the bottles on the back bar and looking at all those weird, looking back, Cragganmore, I remember the label of that just made such an impression. It seemed so otherworldly, and I loved pouring the beer. I loved making glasses of water was my favorite thing because we did it in a wine glass with ice and lemon. And looking back, I just, that's where it started. Like a love for taking pride in even the smallest things, But I never did hospitality as a full-time career until I came to Australia, actually, or rather back to Australia in 2010. I'd actually been working suited and booted in public relations, would you believe it, back in London. I worked in property and planning PR. I did a little politics on the side.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's. I think that's quite a common story in a lot of hospitality. People come from all backgrounds. It's quite interesting. A lot of people change careers to come to this because they're not getting what they want out of their career, and that kind of counted for me as well. I was kind of okay in it. It wasn't the most amazing job, but I enjoyed it. And then obviously the crash happened, or the GFC, as no one else in the world calls it, apart from Australia. And I was working in property planning, so that was just the bottom fell out of that. Never had to take a pay cut. So my partner at the time, a fantastic lady called Dominique Easter, who is doing great things in London at Silo now. She kind of runs the wine program for them. She was like, let's go back to Australia, because if you're going to be broke, you may as well be broke in the sun. So I came back to Sydney in 2010, and that was, I'm not sure, are you a Sydney lady yourself down here? You're Melbourne.
I'm so Melbourne. That is such a weird question. Love Sydney so much, but I am Melbourne through and through.
Well, I wasn't sure. Sometimes you might have the passion of a convert, you know what I mean?
I get that, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's just the Northern Ireland in me coming out. And it was a really exciting time in Sydney in 2010 because Clover Moore had only recently been elected, and they started liberalising the licensing costs. And there was a positive feeling at the time that Sydney needed the up its game. Melbourne had always led the way in terms of hospitality for the breadth and depth, of its scene. That small bar vibe, it just didn't really exist in Sydney unless you count, legendary spots like Barron's from back in the day. But even they were notable by their, exceptionalism. So coming back, I was at the time wanting to kind of still get back into what I've been doing in London. I did an internship with GetUp for a while around the carbon tax campaign. But I was also working at a dive bar, I think, which has passed into a bit of legend now in Sydney, called the Flinders. And was just like doing hospitality full time at the age of 27. Just being a little bit older, and it was such a rush again. It reminded me of that first job. And I started to really enjoy it. And I was thinking, God, if only I could have a job that combined, you know, being an MP during the day and a bartender at night. That'd be perfect for me. But that job doesn't exist yet. And my partner, she opened a fantastic little bar there in Sydney called the Hazy Rose, which was great. Worked there with her and her kind of best friend, our housemate, a lady called Harriet Lee, who does great things with Archie Rose these days. And yeah, you know, Dominic just said to me, why don't you give hospitality everything for the first time? You know, give it everything for a couple of years and see what happens. And the rest is history, really. I realized that this, you know, all the possibilities of the industry kind of opened up for me, like actually by kind of appreciating it fully as a full-time job. And yeah, the Hazy Rose did great for about 5 years there. It was fantastic. I moved on then to work at the Baxter Inn with a pretty fantastic crew of people. And I think quite a few people who were kind of coming up, you know, in that there was a generation that came up at that time from like 2010, 2008. You know, there's a lot of people who work together as bartenders, have moved on to open brands, to be, you know, kind of to run brands and training, you know, here overseas, New York and Singapore. But at the time, we were all kind of working together and having a great time, I think, with Swill House. You know, they've got a great vision. That company, Baxter Inn, was, you know, globally rated at the time. I think it's still your top rated Australian bar in the 50 best bars ever. And then from there moved across to restaurant Hubert, which was the new kind of expansion of the company that Swill House wanted to do. And again, that was actually another kind of like step up for me to, you know, be involved with that as their bar manager, and seeing someone like, you know, Jason Scott and Anton Forte up close. And the attention to detail that they give to building a space was very instructive. You know, we're talking, you know, it was a 7-figure operation. We were talking, you know, 375 capacity, 3 bars, but no detail was too small. You know, even if they set something up and they decided it didn't fit the aesthetic, it's been quite daunting to see the attention that, you know, the real people at the top of their game gave to something. Yeah, and that was great fun, maybe too much fun. You know, hospitality can take a bit of a toll. So I decided to move down to Melbourne for the kind of change scenes. It had been like 8 years in Sydney. I came down here as part of the opening team for the Hotel Esplanade, which in itself was another fantastic, huge operation. I was looking after kind of the cocktail bar at the top floor there, and Sandhill Road, again, some fantastic people at the top with great vision, great drive, and attention to detail second to none, really. I mean, if you've ever been to the Ghost, which is the cocktail bar, that's a work of art in itself. I mean, that should be winning every design award going when you actually look at what's gone into it. But more than that, it was a really good introduction to Melbourne. And if you're a Melbourne local, then you're like, well, of course it's the best city in the world. But moving here, you hear so much about what Melbourne is. And, you know, you're like, well, you know, does it match the hype? And it absolutely does. You know, it's a great city. It's got so many layers to it. I find like Sydney is a city that, you know, it's so brash and it's right there and it kind of gives you everything, and that's great fun. But Melbourne's like much more kind of, you know, densely layered. It's like the onion, you know what I mean?
I love the fact, Brendan, that you speak about moving to Melbourne for the quiet life and then go and open up the Espy, which is just like so busy and so pumping. But as you say, that bar up the top, named after Alfred Felton, who's one of the people that I guess helped create Melbourne as a cultural capital with a huge bequest to the NGV. Yeah. It is a hidden gem, and the detail in that design is extraordinary. So it was his old apartment, and it's decked out a bit like an apartment. I think you instantly feel 5% smarter when you walk in there. And yeah, it's just a really great space. And I also just want to just interrupt this really great story of yours with just when you said, I wish I could work in hospitality full time and also be an MP on the side, and I want to know more about this political bent to your vibe. But have you, and if you haven't, and anyone who's listening, please do go and look at AOC, so Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, American politician.
Another former bartender, huh?
Exactly. And just recently on her stories, she did this whole bit about hospitality and about the skills that you build in hospitality and the pathways that can lead to it and lead from it. And that, just to, I guess, to put a different value on hospitality work that is often put on it, like it is, it's really powerful and inspiring. So I would love everyone to check out her Insta and look at one of her recent highlights about hospo. It's very good. So Brendan, sorry to
not at all.
take over briefly, but yeah.
She even went back and did a shift at her old bar a couple of years ago or something. She after she got elected to Congress. You can look it up. There's a clip of her making cocktails. I mean, that's pretty dope. Yeah. Actually.
Yeah.
And hospitality, there's a lot of crossovers I found. It's a people-facing job. It relies on empathy. It relies on being able to deal with people who are often very upset, but while kind of keeping yourself calm. It's a lot of multitasking. There's definitely, people who are good at politics, even politics with a small p. I think are good at hospitality.
Yeah.
And hospitality itself, my God, it's riven with gossip and scheming and bad behavior and, all sorts of, kind of secrets and lies, all sorts of things to it as well, due to, I think, the nature of the industry. So I can see a crossover with that.
And I suppose also, to put a positive spin on it.
It makes them sound like the worst people, doesn't it?
At its best, politics and hospitality are about, making the world better.
They're about quality of life, aren't they, though?
Yeah.
It's about making quality of life. Why do you come to a bar? You can get drunk at home for about a fifth of the price if that's what you want, but that's not just what you want.
Yeah.
You come here to be made to feel special, to feel that your life's, that you've done something, worth live, rather than just kind of sleep, eat, work, repeat.
Yeah.
Politics should be about making people's lives better. Other than 3-word slogans,
Yep, totally.
Yeah,
love that.
Yeah.
All right. So pick it up. You were making an amazing cocktail on the 4th floor of the Esplanade Hotel, and then what happened next in your life?
The Esplanade, that was a good gig, and it didn't work out because I was going through a bit of a personal time, actually, if I'm honest with you. Hospitality, it can. Again, it sounds like I'm dwelling on negatives, but it can also, it can allow you to indulge some of the, kind of bad habits you might have in life. So I had a tough couple of years personally. And then it was kind of good to be in Melbourne, it was kind of good to be away from some bad influences that I had in Sydney. And being a little bit older as well, it was kind of trying to take stock a bit. I was like, okay, I've kind of come through, I've worked at these great bars, I've had some fun, raised some hell. But, where do I want to go with that? Who do I want to work with? And I was like, well, I'll open a venue, which, was the kind of the genesis of Yarra Falls.
Tell us what Yarra Falls is. Tell us some of its distinguishing features, Brendan.
Look, I think first and foremost, we've got to talk about the waterfall.
I think we do.
I think we do. I think the waterfall in the room. So I suppose I'll talk about the building first. So I wanted to I didn't have the name Yarra Falls picked out. I had some real stinker names for this venue before I found the right one. But I knew I wanted something that, spoke to a sense of place. This land along the river here. And there's a lot of, stories that you can draw from that. So if you're, again, it's always within a respectful, consensual atmosphere. But, if you're talking anything from the very first stories to myself, I'm just moved to Melbourne a couple of years ago. Melbourne is a great city that's made up of the people in it. So I wanted to talk about place. You can talk about that in terms of produce. You can talk about that in terms of music. Our playlists rely very heavily on kind of Melbourne artists, Australian Indigenous artists as well. And then spent about 6 months trying to find the right spot. I had some really good advice from a chap called Rob Liebekens, who's one of the geniuses behind Caretaker's Cottage. Have you been down there yet?
I have been to Caretakers. It is
Yeah.
a great spot, very special.
Great spot. Yeah, good spot. And he had a good bit of experience. And his advice was, if you're going to go looking for like a venue space, just look at everything, even if it like looks really kind of a bit rubbish on paper, because you'll learn something from each kind of viewing that you do, which was great advice. So there was a lot of, I saw a few turkeys, saw a couple of prize hands, but couldn't get the deal just right. I had some really good people in this industry giving me advice. People like Jason Chan, or Ian Ling, who are very successful in this industry themselves. And eventually I came across this little space at Tavistock House. So Tavistock House here at 381 Flinders Lane is actually one of your oldest buildings still standing in Melbourne. It was built in 1850. So it's one of 9 pre-Gold Rush buildings left in the city of Melbourne metropolitan area, because everything got, rebuilt, certainly with the Gold Rush and then Marvellous Melbourne. The upper levels of it actually got redeveloped again in the 1920s, but the whole exterior is heritage listed in its facade. So where this building is, it was actually built on the site of a former hotel that was built in 1836 called the Ship Inn. So 1836 is only a year after Batman turned up. And I was like, okay, so you're talking about, I'm wanting to build a venue on a place where, as long as the colony's been here, people have been kind of getting fed and watered. So I was like, that's pretty cool, in one sense. And then kind of looking at the geography of where we're at, the building itself is about 100 meters from the Queen Street Bridge. And the Queen Street Bridge runs at that odd little angle across the river, because it was built on the remains of the waterfall that used to be on the river. And that was like new to me. Now there's like a Wikipedia article on it. You can look it up. It's not particularly obscure, but it's surprising how many even kind of Melbourne natives are unaware of that little piece of history. So there used to be a long, low kind of tidal waterfall that ran right across the river. It separated the freshwater from the seawater. It was the main crossing point of the river for First Peoples who were here for all that time. And it in itself was a willum. It was a meeting place. It was a place of ceremony, of business. It was a boundary place. Waterways, this is something that I've learned. Waterways are important kind of boundary markers. And when Batman turned up to steal the country in 1835, that was as far as the European ships could travel up the river. They were blocked by the waterfall. So that's when he writes that line in his diary, "This will be the place for a village." So the waterfall is why Melbourne is where it is. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. The waterfall itself was removed, blown up in 1883 to kind of alleviate the chronic flooding issues that the city had. But they built the bridge over the top of it. So every time you walk across the Queen Street Bridge, you're crossing in the exact kind of spot and angle and direction that people crossed, crossed the river for tens of thousands of years, which is, kind of pretty amazing thing to think about. So, yeah, and then I was like, okay,
it's really
Yarra
amazing,
Falls. Isn't it just?
It is amazing to. I mean, it's just have your mind open to it, isn't it? To be able to connect with place in a better way. Yeah, there's a lot of I think people like to talk about place, and there's definitely, certainly with the millennial generation, my generation, and younger, there's a hunger for a connection with place or authenticity of place, I think. You could even, if you talk about food and drink, that's a concept of terroir, right? Where something reflects the kind of the elements of where it's from. So that was pretty amazing, and I was like, okay, Yarra Falls. All right, let's go with Yarra Falls. It suddenly seemed like a nice name for it. It's got 3 syllables, which is always good for a name, and it kind of works in a couple of ways. It's a little bit like Night Falls, Yarra Falls. So if you're talking about something that's a sensitive place, Yarra Falls. It's also an interesting use of the word Yarra. It's something that is getting more well known is that Yarra isn't the actual name of the river in the local kind of Kulin languages. This isn't obviously my kind of knowledge, but you can go and look it up, what the name of the river actually is. It's pretty well known. It means River of Mists, which is pretty cool. But at no stage has any of the
the kind of the actors in the field, and I've spoken to some quite senior elders as well. At no point has anyone gone that this was an inappropriate project to continue. They just said, take your time, and continually come back for consent. And that's been great, because at heart, Yarra Falls, it isn't a theme bar. We're not a theme bar. I'm not repackaging, other people's culture for other people's enjoyment. What we're about, is acknowledgement where it's appropriate, and starting to, again, coming back to that central idea of putting natives in context where it's appropriate and consensual. And it's great. We've got this little 25-seat bar. We work with brands that kind of share ethos and values. So people like Applewood, for example, or Little Brunswick Wines, are businesses that don't just acknowledge, but they, actively support Indigenous-owned or supporting businesses as well. So it's about, I was trying to sum it up one day, and someone said it's pretty much paying the rent, isn't it? And I was like, yeah, it's about trying to pay the rent where possible.
Wow. Yeah. It's complex. There's a lot to it, and I think it's it's a great acknowledgement of the place that you're on, the country we're all on, and just so much food for thought, as well as a nice place to have a drink.
Well, that's it. At heart, everyone just it's about good fun, good times, good tunes, and that's a universal, right? Doesn't matter what culture you're from. People like to come to a nice space. They like to have a nice drink, whether it's alcoholic or not, and listen to some good music. Come back to right at the start of the podcast. We're like, why do people go out? They go out to feel that they're kind of, making the most of their life. And if they want to, talk a bit about other things, if they come here and it makes them go and do a bit of research and learning afterwards, and that's great. But if you just want to come here and get a bit loose and, try and chat up the person next to you respectfully, then you can do that too.
Well, Brendan, the first thing that I'm going to have when I come in is I'm going to ask you to make me a glass of water.
Absolutely. Oh, it's great. I always thought it was fantastic. Lots of ice and a big slice of lemon is the key.
Yeah, I love it. Well, what a journey, and obviously you're still on it, as we all are. But congrats on Yarra Falls, Brendan, and thanks so much for giving us an insight into everything that's brought you to this point. Real pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dani. Have a great day.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinenat.deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This